Bonnie, it's so great to have you in our program Leading Complexity this year. I know you're an author, a researcher, complexity thinker, business developer, teacher. You're so many things. I think you're probably one of the broadest kind of persons that we have on the program. And
I'm exhausted.
yeah,
I'm exhausted hearing my introduction.
and you integrate so many fields. I know you study natural sciences, living system, consciousness studies, relational processes, philosophy, self-management, self-organizations, etc. So I think your work really intrigues me, and your thinking on complexity specifically. And our program is dedicated to helping leaders in complexity. So what would you say is kind of a pitfall or some recommendation for leaders working with these complex situations today?
That's a great question. So when we use the term complexity, even when I just hear it, I get a mental model of what that looks like. It'll be different for different people. People might see a vortex, a water vortex. Some people see, Peter Senge's diagrams. Some people experience, something like maybe a theater in a military theater, and depending upon what workshops you've gone to. So what happens is, I want to point out that when we use that word complexity, we start immediately having a mental model or a movie or a framework that I occupy. So if you say to me, let's talk about complexity, then I'm going to be inside this mental model. And I think the biggest pitfall is that many people's mental models of complexity are not true complexity. They're complicated, or even too chaotic. Like they might not find enough order inside of their mental model, or they find too much order that's more like complicated. And so the real question here is, what is an adequate mental model of complexity? And I would say something like being a gardener, or raising children, or anything that, life is the most complex thing that we know. So anything that creates more life, I would say, is a great mental model for complexity.
Mm. And one of the key concepts that I like from you is a concept of releasing complexity. Could you explain a little why that's important?
Yeah. So that's a intentional phrase, because releasing complexity does not reduce complexity, right? We're all smart enough to know that if you reduce the complexity of the situation, if you try to isolate the variables, if you have simple linear cause and effect, that's reducing complexity, and that's not navigating complexity. So what do I mean by releasing complexity? And I always tell the story of the shift from the solar system as seen by Ptolemy to Copernicus. So Ptolemy won a prize because he figured out the math that could predict the position of all the planets in the night sky. Certainly the planets they knew up until then. And the reason why that was difficult is because if you're tracking, let's say, Mercury, it moves through the night sky like this, and then it starts to move through the night sky going backwards. That's called retrograde, and people, supposedly the werewolves come out at retrograde. And so the Ptolemy and the people at the time understood that the stars and the planets were moving like a sphere, but they couldn't understand retrograde. So Ptolemy said, well, this is what's happening. Mercury's moving this way, but it's moving in epicycles as it moves this way. And that would explain why it was still moving around the night sky, but when it was in its epicycle, it would appear that it was going backwards. Okay. So he worked this out. Venus, I think, too, has a retrograde, and he had all the math worked out, and it was extremely accurate for the time. And you see these astrolabs now that are models of what he built. But what you see is that math was extremely complex. And then Copernicus or Galileo comes around and they say, oh, what if we looked at the solar system as if the sun was in the middle? And now everything in the planets go around the sun, not around the earth. And now the math is more predictive and simpler because you don't have cycles within cycles. And so he didn't reduce the complexity because all the information, actually more information's in the system now, but the system, how we could model the system became much simpler. So it releases the complexity, and then it allows us to build even more explanatory power on that, because now the whole thing has been simplified, but not simplified reductively. So that's a good definition of releasing complexity.
And I think the potential here is for us working in organizations to kind of see where we have had created this unnecessary complexity, trying to manage it rather than finding more powerful, easier, more simple ways to
address. And a lot of times we know we're doing it. So for example, you might get into a situation, a bidding war with one of your employees. And you know, if I just give in and give him the raise, the next time he's going to leverage me again. And you can see that this will never end. And you can feel that, you know, you're going to build in more complexity into the system. Or if you pay this one on the side and you don't want him to know, you can feel that you're just exacerbating the situation. It's a manager's nightmare. And what we are trying to do is teach people, just don't make that move. You have no idea how much complexity. It's not just these two guys or these two employees that are going to start, but it's all going to go around and around. And you won't even know that this incident that got really complex is actually an outcome of this instance. So we try to get people to be really confident not to make those moves. So sometimes that's what I'm saying. Sometimes we don't see that that's the situation, but sometimes we just kind of know it, and we need help or training, or we need to develop the confidence just not to do that.
Great. So your session in the program is titled Thinking with Complexity, Post-formal actors, protocols, complex potential states. So what's the kind of benefit for leaders and consultants that they will take away from that?
So thinking with protocols is about releasing complexity. So Scrum, for example, is a protocol. And you can think of the protocol as doing a lot of the work in the room, but it's quite simple. It's a quite simple protocol. You can think of OODA loop as a protocol. And what protocols do is they reduce the cognitive complexity of a task demand, right? So they're very simple. They're not rules, they're more like patterns to follow, and they tend to bias action. So it puts us in the world in these feedback loops. So thinking with protocols, how can we do more of that? I mean, we could adopt the OODA loop, but just in our daily lives, how can we turn kind of a messy desk into a protocol or steps for action? And there's a lot of people in the agile world that intuitively think in terms of protocols, and we're just trying to expand that understanding. And then one of the protocol sets that I will introduce is to move from complex adaptive systems thinking to thinking in terms of complex potential states. I won't get into that much right now because that's really the heart of the workshop or the presentation. But it just, to give you an example, and it pings back on releasing complexity, and that is when we think in terms of complex adaptive systems, which is the mental model that many people adopt when they're thinking complexity, we're inevitably setting up an arms race, right? So I'm going to spray the pests, and the pests get more immune, and they're going to come back, and or you think viruses and vaccines or bacteria and antibiotics, or even in government policy. So complex adaptive systems thinking often sets this arms race that escalates because all the systems are adapting to everyone else. And so thinking in terms of complex potential states is a way to have a mental model about complexity that doesn't enter into this escalating feedback loop. And yeah, it's a really kind of exciting thing to introduce.
Yeah, so I recognize all this escalating complexity kind of builds bureaucracy, creating organizations that go really slow, creating a lot of politics, slower decision making, all this kind of thing. So
yeah, you end up 90% of your work is managing the work you made for yourself. And I mean, we all feel this. It's very hard to get out of the system, but what if we could take small parts of our lives, or small parts of our jobs, or small parts of our company, and protocol this way of working with complexity? I think that it's people, we need a new way.
Yeah. So yes, this will be so exciting. Really looking forward to digging into this and hearing more from you on the October 10th in our Leading Complexity program.
Yeah, I can't wait to see the other speakers too. So
yeah,
happy to be part of this.
You're invited also to participate in watching the whole program. So
I will. I definitely will.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Bonnie.
Thank you.